Welcome to Nerds at Church, a queer feminist podcast diving deep into faith, nerdery, and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss John Brown as our main hero for the day. Also, Paul's letter to Philemon, which is our biblical hero, comes up in the lectionary on Proper 18 or lectionary 23 in Year C, which next falls on September 7th, 2025. And we'll link to our past episode in our episode description for you. We have some big content notifications for you for this episode. We talk about slavery throughout the entire episode. We mention comfort women while talking about Kira Nerys, our second hero, and we talk about violence and capital punishment when discussing John Brown.
We'd also like to invite you to become a Patreon supporter for more content at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch, and check out the episode description for links to any references we make in this episode. And if you do become a Patreon supporter, well, hey, you could listen to Emily reading the Book of Philemon.
It's true. The Book of Philemon is a very different experience when read versus when heard. So we recorded a way for you to hear it for those of you who are Patreon supporters. So make sure you check it out. It's very quick read. It's the entire Book of Philemon.
That might actually be our miniest mini episode.
It might be our only mini episode.
We have attempted mini episodes several times, but I think this is the only time we've actually achieved one.
Yeah, it is a whole 25 verses.
Yeah, coming in at slightly over 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And our overall theme today between all of our various heroes is on how far non-enslaved people are willing to go for people who are enslaved. So I also want to be clear, depending on how you understood the phrasing earlier, Philemon is not actually our hero for today. Paul writing to Philemon is. And then we also have Kira Nerys from Deep Space Nine as our pop culture hero, and then John Brown as our historical hero.
Indeed. I bet by the end of this season, we'll have figured out how to phrase the introduction to the episode so that it makes sense to people.
Just in time for us to switch to a different theme and probably change our format considerably.
A totally different way of doing it. Yep. Anyway, as Kay mentioned, part of why we wanted to do the overall theme of how far non-enslaved people will go for people who are enslaved. And it connects to some of the other themes that we're dealing with, especially next episode. But part of it is when we are talking about heroes, a lot of the times we're talking about people who are doing all these great things, but we don't talk about the dynamics of privilege and power and how much risk gets taken for the sake of someone else who has less privilege and less power. And so this is a particular example that works really well for all three of these heroes around slavery. But it's not the only time when we think about this. It's for people who weren't Jewish or Romani during the Holocaust. How far would they go to hide those who were? And not just to hide those who were, but to help them be safe and alive, to risk their own everything. So, yeah, there's a lot to kind of unpack in each of the heroes, but also in the overarching, what does it mean to be a hero? So, diving into Paul writing to Philemon. I'm not going to do a whole deep dive into Paul because we already did that in Easter Year C. So we will link to that episode as well if you want to dig into Paul more. And we are happy to let you dig away. But specifically, we're talking about this letter, which is titled Philemon, which is Paul writing to Philemon about Onesimus. So some just kind of basic info about this letter. It was likely written by actual Paul. So it's one of the ones that we think is an authentic Pauline epistle, as opposed to Colossians, which it frequently gets put together with, which while it's written in Paul's name, it's probably not written by Paul himself. And it is one of the three quote-unquote captivity epistles, which is Philippians, which is also written likely by actual Paul, and Colossians, and then Philemon. It was likely written from Ephesus in the mid-50s Common Era. So this is after Jesus has died, but these are probably some of the earliest writings, right?
Sure.
When we look at all of what we call the New Testament, the earliest actual scripture we have is from Paul. It's not the Gospels, it's not the other stuff, it's from Paul. And so there are some people who think that, like, the second place option for where Paul is writing from, because he's writing from prison, and so there are limited number of places.
I mean, he was thrown in prison a lot, but still only in a limited number of places.
Right. So the other option is him writing from Rome around 61 to 63 CE. The idea that it comes from Ephesus has to do with how close Ephesus is to Colossae, which is the location of Philemon and the others addressed in the letter. And I'm getting a lot of this information from the Jewish Annotated New Testament, because we love that. And so if you want to check that out, you can buy it on bookshop.org from our affiliate link, or you can check it out from a library, get your library to buy it, all sorts of things.
Absolutely. Listen, if there is one resource about the New Testament that this podcast unequivocally, enthusiastically suggests that you try out, I think it's the Jewish Annotated New Testament. It's amazing.
Yep, it's true. So that's a lot of the background for this, but also Paul is writing this letter to specifically Philemon. So when we have the Thanksgiving in verse 4, when Paul writes, "When I remember you in my prayers," he's not saying y'all. This is, again, my soapbox. The Bible should use y'all or some version of you plural when it is you plural, because it would provide so much more clarity in the English. But so when I remember you in my prayers, Paul is specifically talking about Philemon and to Philemon. But it's in the context of a whole community, right? So this is like peer pressure for good, where he's saying, Philemon and all these people who are looking to you to model what it means to be a faithful follower of Christ.
Yeah, I love talking about how this is using peer pressure for good. There is a bit in the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which is a mini-series on YouTube covering the story of Pride and Prejudice as Elizabeth Bennet's video diary, basically, of the story.
I love that.
It's hilarious. And there is a bit in there where her younger sister, Lydia, understands that peer pressure exists but doesn't really understand how it works, and so her version of it is to poke her sister in the side and say, peer pressure, peer pressure, peer pressure, over and over again. Weirdly enough, it kind of works. And
Right.
now, every time that I read this letter, I have the mental image of Paul doing that to Philemon, and it's hilarious.
Yeah, that is fantastic. So the setup for the letter, right, is peer pressure for good, but also it's in the context of a culture that is very deeply rooted in honor and shame. And so Paul is, appealing to Philemon's better nature, but also is giving Philemon the option to choose honor, while also, warning him that he could shame him into it. He could force him into it, right? For this reason, though I am bold enough in Christ to command you to do your duty, yet I would rather appeal to you on the basis of love. So there's all of this nuance into what Paul is saying that we don't necessarily catch, because that's not how we talk, that's not how we function today.
I mean, also, when you take into account the fact that Paul is pointing out that he is essentially the spiritual father of both Philemon and Onesimus, and therefore he has a parental relationship with them, some of us have experience of our parents saying, I don't want to tell you to do this, but this is something you're going to do, and you can either do it because I ask you, or because I tell you, but that's really up to you.
Wow, my parents did not ever do that, and I am grateful, because that does not feel like a choice.
It wasn't a regular thing. Usually it was more about the, showing that you care to another family member who you might be slightly pissed off at the time, and that kind of thing. And so it didn't happen a lot, but every so often special circumstances would show up, and...
Yeah. Whew. Anywho, yeah. So a lot of what Paul is doing, right, reminding Philemon that he literally owes Paul his life. As he's sending Onesimus back. So Onesimus, from what we can tell, has been enslaved and is Philemon's slave, and there's a large number of people who consider him to be a runaway slave. It's not 100% clear on that. There's some newer scholarship that kind of pushes back against that idea,
claiming that perhaps Philemon sent Onesimus to Paul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but what we do know is that Onesimus and Paul somehow encountered each other while Paul was in prison, and Onesimus came to Jesus, became a follower of the way, became part of the church. This particular letter is unique because it has been used to justify slavery in the United States.
Yeah.
And it has been used to advocate for abolition in the United States. So it's a complicated letter because of the context, right? When you read it in context, it is really quite clear that what Paul is trying to do is to get Philemon to free Onesimus.
Mm-hmm.
In the introduction to Philemon in the Jewish Annotated New Testament, scholar Barbara Geller writes, "Is Paul seeking Onesimus's continued service for himself?" as in verses 13 and 14. "Is he seeking to ensure that Philemon receive his returned slave with welcome and forgiveness?" as in verses 17 and 18. And perhaps, quote, even more, from verse 21, is Paul suggesting Philemon manumit Onesimus, which is release him from servitude, since he is now a, quote, beloved brother to both Paul and Philemon in the church, as in verses 16 and 21. And so that question really gets at, how do we figure out what Paul is even trying to do, what the goal of this letter is, and recognizing that because it is written the way it's written, it can be interpreted and skewed in a variety of ways for a particular bias that someone has.
Yeah.
And so, it's fascinating. I did not always like Philemon for those reasons, that it's not a clear slavery is bad. Slavery is the only thing that Paul has ever known. He has never known a world without chattel slavery.
Although we are perfectly happy on this podcast to say, yes, slavery is bad.
Yes.
That is a true thing.
To be perfectly clear, that's why we're doing this episode. Slavery, bad. And it wasn't until I heard this letter performed as Scripture by Heart by David Rhodes, who is really well known in the Scripture by Heart New Testament scholarship stuff, that I really heard it and realized how much more clearly it is not abolitionist, because Paul's not advocating for the abolition of all slavery, but is advocating decidedly for Onesimus to be freed from slavery.
Yeah. Also, I'm not entirely convinced that Paul could, conceive the concept of a world without slavery. That is not a universe in which...
Yeah, that's what they say in the introduction, is, it's not fathomable to Paul at this point.
Mm-hmm.
To abolish slavery. Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's on par with abolishing gravity. I might say it's on par with, us imagining abolishing capitalism.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Well, we'd have to figure out something else instead, but yes.
Yeah, we could do it. But yeah, it's the water that he swims in, right? And so part of what I love about the Book of Philemon and about this plea that Paul makes on behalf of Onesimus is that, in this country, if we were to, put it in this country, right, in modern day, it would actually be an enslaved person writing to someone to free their slave, right? Yeah. Because in this country, when we abolished slavery, we included a line that says if someone is in prison, they can be a slave. And we have slave conditions in our prison system where people make pennies per hour, and everything is exorbitantly expensive at the commissary, making phone calls to home, all of that stuff. So when we think about what does it look like to abolish slavery, to work towards that, we have to think about incarceration in this country, which we dug deep into this with Pastor Elle Dowd in the first time that she was on that podcast, and so we'll link to that episode as well, but it has to be connected. Yeah, so what do we love about them?
I have to say I really loved Emily's rendition of the Book of Philemon as recorded for our special Patreon episode. And my two favorite phrases from that were definitely Emily doing the line of, "I, Paul, as an old man," which was fantastic. Also, we don't usually record video, but I kind of wish we had for that because the look on your face was amazing.
I thought about it.
Yeah. And then also the part of, "I'm not commanding you to do this, but..." And those were great. And now I'm also going to treasure in my heart the image, of course, of Paul poking Philemon and saying, "Peer pressure, peer pressure, peer pressure." So
I will also have the peer pressure thing in my head now because, yeah, it's really great. As I've said already, love the scripture by heart part. I also was struck when I was reading this before we recorded of the confident of your obedience. And it reminded me of Hamilton. When it's like, "Oh, your obedient servant," while he's like, fomenting rebellion and all of those sorts of things and scheming.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just love that part. And it is a great introduction to, like, what is the most basic thing that Paul could do for an enslaved person. He writes to the person who has enslaved them or who holds ownership of them and tries to free this person.
Yeah.
That is, at a very basic level, like, bare minimum, what can you do for someone who is oppressed?
Also, hey, modern day Christians, let's look at this beautiful example of direct communication.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's direct-ish.
Hi, please.
It's direct for the context.
Please free this person. Yeah. Like, that is what you can do, yes.
Yep. And it's important to name that we don't hear from Onesimus in this.
No.
Right? There is tradition that exists that Onesimus becomes a bishop in the church later on. So there's traditions that have built up that say...
There was a bishop in the church shortly after this who was named Onesimus, and there's thoughts that that might have been this person. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Whether or not it is historically factual, it has become part of Christian tradition that this Onesimus eventually becomes the Onesimus who is bishop. So I think it's important to know that, like, we don't hear from Onesimus, and because of the way communication and honor and shame and all of that works, this was the most effective way Paul had of freeing Onesimus, and presumably Paul and Onesimus talked before this happened.
I would hope so.
So it was not just, like,
Yeah, no, writing this letter without talking to Onesimus first would have been a terrible example of direct communication, because in this case, don't do something when someone has no control over their life. Yikes. Also, though, I don't know where this came from, but I think in my early understanding of this letter, someone along the way implied that Onesimus was also the person delivering the letter to Philemon. I find that kind of unlikely. Yeah. But also, can you imagine having to... Like, on the one hand, I want to imagine that Onesimus would have this absolutely butter would not melt in his mouth, "I am a perfect angel" look on his face. And yet, on the other hand, that would be frickin' terrifying.
Yeah, I have not heard ever that Onesimus was the one writing this letter. And I thought about that, and I was
like delivering the letter, not
or delivering, But I thought about that, and it's like, no, it would have had to be somebody else. Because they have to, like, have Onesimus there with them to refer to Onesimus. And, like, Onesimus coming back by himself risks so much more without someone there to say, "Hey, I got words to tell you about this guy." Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And the tie-in to today's theme, obviously, an incarcerated individual writes to free an enslaved individual who we assume has run away, but also may have been sent or some other reason.
Right. Listen, a lot of us have wound up in jail for reasons that are just too complicated to explain, and if Onesimus was one of them, such is life.
Thanks. I appreciate that. So, in terms of media, there are a lot of commentaries on Philemon. Mostly they are combined with Colossians because Philemon is so short and Colossians is pretty short, or at least one other epistle.
Yeah.
So many of them are written by white people. Just no one's a monolith, blah, blah, blah. Please, if you are reading a commentary, check so you know at least if the person is white, because it's very different to be talking about freeing an enslaved person as a white person in the United States especially, but anywhere in the world.
Right.
And as a person of color, and then even more so as a Black person.
Yeah.
So definitely check that out. We're not linking to any white people, but we are going to link you to the book. Like, it's actually already on our bookshop list for season 5 because that's where I found it, and so I put it on while I was there. But the book is Onesimus Our Brother, Reading Religion, Race, and Culture in Philemon, Paul in Critical Contexts, which is a collection of essays edited by Demetrius K. Williams, Matthew V. Johnson, and James Gerard Knoll. And all of the essays are from African American scholars, including womanist Philemon scholar Mitzi J. Smith. So if you want to dig into this, this is how you dig into it. This book would be the ideal way to do it.
Yeah. So our second supporting hero for today is Kira Nerys, a character from the TV show Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which, by the way, is a show that I have seen and Emily has not.
Never, I think. I've seen like a couple episodes of some Star Trek something.
Yes. If there's a series that I think you would love of Star Trek in particular, it would be Deep Space Nine, for a lot of reasons. Also, Calvin is sitting on me and giving me headbutts, so that may impact my narration of Kira's story.
I hear that.
Yeah.
While Calvin gives the headbutts. So right now I'm rewatching/watching all of Doctor Who. So it's definitely not happening right now. But you, Pace, and I have talked unofficially, behind the scenes, about potentially doing something where I watch Star Trek for the first time and you two join me in that or something like that. So, all sorts of possibilities of what we do. Just saying.
Like Mark reads, except it would be Emily watches, but yes.
Yeah.
Kira Nerys, family name Kira, personal name Nerys, was almost never a member or employee of Starfleet. Thank you very much. Except that one time, very briefly, for unusual circumstances that we don't really talk about. But she objected to a lot of things Starfleet did and their methods loudly and at length. Her character, who was played by actress Nana Visitor, I think I'm pronouncing that right. The accent is supposed to be on the second syllable of Nana. It's a French name.
Oh, like Mama. Nana.
Yes. Yeah, Nana. She was introduced in the first episode of Deep Space Nine, which was the first Starfleet show to center on a space station instead of on a spaceship. And she was the highest-ranking Bajoran officer of the space station, which was to be shared between Starfleet and the planet of Bajor. And she served as Commander, later Captain Ben Sisko's second-in-command for the run of the show, and later she essentially inherited command of the space station from him when he leaves the station at the end. Because Emily has not seen the show, I'm trying very hard to not include, like, major plot spoilers, for the most part, in Kira's story.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Also, like anyone who has not seen the show, I'm going to vaguely mention some things that will make more sense later, but after you've seen it. But we're going to try to be pretty general here. I also want to point out the show in general is excellent with very few dud episodes, but I should warn you, let's just say that show has all of the content warnings. Like, this series was a lot. So it went to some much more serious places than even Next Generation did. And it did so well, for the most part, but it was a lot. And you really never know when the emotional landmines are going to show up. So, what is Kira Nerys known for? Well, the planet Bajor had been under military occupation of the Cardassian Empire for 50 years, with the Bajorans being treated as slaves and prisoners by the Cardassians during that time. Bajor was not the only planet that Cardassia was occupying, it was just also on the border of the Cardassian Empire with the United Federation of Planets, which is what Starfleet is a part of. And also, it was particularly well-known and well-liked by the Starfleet folks because they were a cultural center and like a cultural heart for that part of space before the Cardassians basically beat them to a pulp. And they were known for not having a standing army because they had been such wonderful neighbors to all of their immediate neighbors for so long. And so a lot of people actually left Starfleet in order to fight against the Cardassian occupation of Bajor during that time. That's a subplot during Next Generation for quite a while there.
just have to tell you, every time you say Cardassian,
Yes,
think
I know. There's
Kardashian.
that family that starts with the letter K that, yeah, that's not an unusual thing now, but they weren't a thing back then.
But
Yeah.
the brilliance is, they weren't a thing back then. And now you're talking about this empire that, like, takes over and colonizes and all of this stuff.
I will say that the Cardassians, as in the aliens, had much better fashion sense. So, just before the show starts, that is Deep Space Nine, Bajor throws off Cardassian control and gains their freedom. It's a long story. But that relationship between Bajor and Cardassia remains complicated for the rest of the show, especially since Starfleet and the Cardassian Empire are not allies. Like, they have sort of very steadily not been going to war with each other, mostly because they know they're about evenly matched and it wouldn't go well for anybody. But they aren't allies. And so it's nervous for everybody.
Okay.
And various themes such as slavery and the treatments of prisoners of war and the interpersonal politics of, I'm going to use the term comfort women. I think the show uses a different term, but it's basically the same concept as the whole Korea-Japan thing during World War II and so forth. All of those concepts and more are explored repeatedly throughout the run of the show. And they do occasionally come out of left field during the series as well. And so Kira herself was an officer in the Bajoran resistance forces during the occupation, and then subsequently to the end of the occupation, the resistance forces turned into the Bajoran militia. And there's a whole transitional thing there where, you know, when they were a resistance, they didn't really have rules, and then they have to come up with some rules, and it's a lot more work than they thought it would be, and so that's kind of interesting to watch.
That's like the episode of West Wing when they are trying to help this country, like, figure out a constitution to be a democracy or whatever, and they're just going around and talking about all of these values and stuff, and they're talking to Toby about it, and they're like, we don't have a constitution. He's like, no, but hashing out the ideals and the values and all of that stuff is necessary in order to create the Constitution later.
Right, and it's good that you bring that up, because I'm about to talk about that part of Kira's character. She is highly experienced at guerrilla warfare, spy techniques, and survival-related issues under occupation, including, like, survival in the wilderness, on her planet and elsewhere, and also survival in, like, say, a spaceship that is also on fire, that kind of thing. And while she does have a few moral lines that she herself will not cross, she also absolutely never expects anyone else, especially anyone she's fighting against, to actually follow so-called rules of war. She is continually surprised when people who work for Starfleet do, because she's known that Starfleet doesn't always do that, actually. Also, she is way more comfortable with crossing several of the usual rules of war than her Starfleet counterparts are, mostly because when the Starfleet counterparts show up on Deep Space Nine, they send her a bunch of uptight, stuffy rule followers, which she is not entirely on board with. Like, not all of them are, but a bunch of them are. That's kind of a characteristic they were looking for when they looked for people for that space station. And so she is always, as a character, practical and, like, application-focused, instead of thinking about the theoretical ideals that Starfleet is so fond of. And she also has very little time in her life for people who aren't willing to, you know, get their hands dirty with actual necessary work. And one of my favorite characteristics of her is that she has an extremely expressive and memeable face. She has so many wonderful facial expressions. I love them all. And it's a shame that the TV show was made long enough ago that the VHS quality of the recording is not quite good enough for modern-day internet. I should also point out that the Bajoran religion is also very important to the planet and their people, and Kira is a faithful follower of that religion, although she's not as observant as some people are, but also, you can get super observant of that religion, so, like, a lot of people are at Kira's level of following it. And the religious aspects of her character and the storylines are actually handled pretty well in the show, and with some sensitivity, especially for the 90s. Like, this was really good writing. So, when it comes to what do you love about them, I especially love how practical Kira is, and she is almost always the person asking, okay, so how is this actually going to work? And I love that she was the character most likely to say out loud what I was thinking, such as, "What's wrong with you?" Or, "Why did you think that was a good idea?" And I think Emily will also be interested in the fact that Kira had a long-term relationship with another character who was an alien of a species that did not really do gender, Odo.
Is that the species that you are reborn or whatever in another body? Kind of
Oh,
thing?
no, you're thinking of Jadzia Dax, who also, like, the Trill have gender, but the symbiote part of their species doesn't do gender, but, like, the host part of their species does. Whereas Odo is a shapeshifter who generally presents as slightly masculine because he started working on the station when it was under Cardassian control, and the Cardassians are somewhat misogynistic. They have aspects of misogyny that work differently than humanities do, but they do generally tend to give more weight to men, and so Odo decided to take on a masculine form. But the shapeshifters can, do whatever they want. Odo regularly, takes the form of a chair, so gender isn't really something that applies to Odo, even though he does use male pronouns.
Nice. Yeah, for a second, I thought that this was going to be the episode that I know that for a fact that I've watched, but no.
Yes, no, Jadzia is also awesome, but honestly, it takes a lot for me to find a character I like more than Jadzia, and honestly, Kira Nerys actually is that character. She is just awesome in so many different ways.
Nice.
And otherwise, also, while her character did have a couple boyfriends during the run of the show, not counting Odo, because Odo doesn't really count as a boyfriend, her character was very strongly queer-coded for the 90s in terms of how TV worked back then.
Yeah, I saw her haircut.
Yes. Yeah. She became an icon.
Nice.
Yeah. So her tie-in for today's theme is that she literally helps free her entire planet from slavery, which is awesome.
Amazing.
And, yeah.
I am excited that she's queer-coded, because, of course. And, just hearing about her, I really like the space that you're talking about of wrestling with particularly rules of war and guerrilla warfare, because that can be so complicated. I mean, we're looking at it right now in Palestine and Israel and the Middle East, and what is okay and what is not okay. And the reality is that we have deemed okay formal military tactics and deemed not okay guerrilla warfare.
Right. I would have to say I imagine that watching the show right now with the conflict currently going on there would feel entirely different than it did in the 90s, which, there was lots of warfare going on in the 90s, but
it was a different... Yeah.
Yeah, if you have, loved ones in Israel, Palestine, this might not be the time to start watching this TV show. I'm just saying.
Noted.
It's gonna hit like a rock. Yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe this is the time for others of us to...
Yeah, no, it could. I could also see it radicalizing people. They do a lovely job. And Kira does kind of go on a journey during the seasons of the show, realizing that, actually, she might generally speaking hate Cardassians, but they are people and they deserve to be treated like people. And there are probably individuals that aren't that terrible. And some of the more specific rules of warfare that she realizes, oh, I see why you think that's important now. Okay, fine. That sort of thing. But also, she does still very much remain herself.
Nice.
And for media, she also appears, obviously, in all of the episodes, I think, of Deep Space Nine, but also she appears in an episode of Star Trek Lower Decks as well, and there are oodles of Star Trek novels. I have no idea how many she shows up in, but the answer is probably a lot. So, oodles is a technical term, of course.
Of course. Precise amount. Nice. Yeah, I'm excited to dig into Star Trek eventually.
Yeah, no, I know that Jadzia would be the obvious character to use to sell you on Deep Space Nine, but I really think you're going to like Kira too.
Yeah. Well, and part of the way that I operate, right? I know that I will get into it, and that means I need to have a certain amount of free space in my life to watch it.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, no, this is definitely a show you'll want to binge. And also, it was kind of the first time that Star Trek had ongoing story arcs that lasted several episodes, because Next Generation kind of tried that, but it didn't go very well, but Deep Space Nine has several. And then later there's a war, so,
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. No, I'm excited to eventually check it out. And now, for our main hero of the day, John Brown.
Yay.
So you could be like me and not really know who John Brown was because you grew up in Colorado, and that's not what we covered in history class, because you only really get like one abolitionist to know about at a time. So now that's what this is for. It's our superhero spectacular season, but it's also our history buffs season.
Yes.
Secret history class. What?
I feel like I should point out that the only reason I knew about John Brown was that I heard a couple of people who frankly were not white and who I very much respected mention him in passing, and so I looked up his Wikipedia page. So that's why I knew more about him. But yeah.
Smart. I thought you just had like a randomly actual good history
I mean, he might have actually come up in a history class at some point. That's possible, but I don't remember it.
Well, now I live a lot closer to, the places mentioned, and so...
Yes.
We have been talking about going to Harper's Ferry, and so now I'm like, now I really want to go. Anyway,
yeah.
John Brown. John Brown was born in 1800 to parents who had begun life poor, but throughout his life, his father ended up owning a tannery and employed the father of President Grant. And having learned abolitionism from his father, John Brown passed it down to his own children as well. And he and his sons participated in many anti-slavery actions, many of which included violence, including the Potawatomi Massacre and the raid at Harper's Ferry, for which Brown was tried and executed by the state of Virginia in 1859. And he was the first person to be tried for treason against a state since the founding of the United States.
Yeah, and when you hear the story of why, that becomes even more amazing.
Yes, and also, he was white, in case you did not catch that yet.
That is actually a very big part of his story. Yeah. And also, I feel like I should mention that he was a evangelical Christian in the old way of using the word evangelical, and he grew up in a very Puritan religious background, and all of that influenced everything he did. Like, honestly, when I first started writing this, I had to double check that he wasn't actually a preacher himself, because his faith was a huge part of all of his writing and speeches and choices.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So these summaries don't really bring that up, but that is the case.
Nice.
So what happened at Harper's Ferry? The original plan was to steal weapons that were stored in the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now in West Virginia. And they were going to take those weapons from the federal arsenal and arm the local enslaved black men with those weapons in hopes of starting a serious rebellion against slavery that would then spread, and these rebels would be able to go further south and recruit new people and steal new weapons and supplies, and then those people would be able to go further south, and it would just spread across the country. So, under an assumed name, John Brown rented a house in nearby Maryland, claiming that he was analyzing the area for mining possibilities, which was a thing that had been considered before, so people took that seriously, because he needed a cover reason for why crates of supplies kept being shipped to him. And when visitors came by the house, he would appear to be doing soil analysis tests. And so actually all the neighbors who met him thought that he was a super intelligent person, and he got a great reputation because they were all so impressed at all his science. But actually he was making, bombs and other tools for the raid instead. So he was not actually doing any soil analysis. And so he and his allies eventually gathered together a group of 21 other men besides himself. 5 of them were black and the rest were white, including 3 of his sons, who came to the farm to stay and train. But due to having to conceal their presence from the neighbors, they all spent their days pent up inside the house. John Brown himself and 1 or 2 others would occasionally go out, but they didn't want most people to know that there were so many people living at the house. And so they would train at night and during thunderstorms, so that other people wouldn't be able to see how many people were actually living there. He was concerned about not having a black co-leader for the raid. Like, he did have 5 black men with him, but they weren't really taking on leadership roles. And so he tried to recruit both Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass for that role. But Tubman was ill, and Douglass heard the plan, told John Brown he thought it was a suicide mission, and said no thank you.
Which is fascinating. That's, that is a big deal, right? Like, the recognition, I don't have any black people who are co-leading this, and someone who is black saying, everyone's gonna die doing this, and then going ahead with it anyway. Okay.
I mean, there are apparently records, like, he changed several significant things because of Douglas's
good
contributions, I believe. So he was listening, but also, like,
yeah,
to an extent, yeah, if you're gonna attack a federal arsenal, that does sound awfully dangerous.
Yep.
So, one of Brown's allies, named Hugh Forbes, who was supposedly helping train Brown's followers at the house, frankly extorted Brown and probably set his plans back quite a bit. On the other hand, Mary Ellen Pleasant, who is one of the candidates for the first American black woman to be a millionaire, because it's either her or Mrs. C.J. Walker. It kind of depends on how you count the word millionaire, basically, is what I understand. But Mary Ellen Pleasant donated $30,000 to Brown, which in 2023 money is the equivalent of $1.1 million. So that is a ton of money.
Yeah.
Yeah. And probably there were at least about 80 people who knew about various parts of this plan before anything actually started happening. But the only person who ever knew all of the plan was Brown himself. Even the people living with him in that house. Like, all of them knew different parts of the plan, but none of them knew the whole thing of how it was all going to work.
Which keeps the plan more secure.
Yes, exactly. That's why he was doing it. On the other hand, that whole thing about how, maybe this is a problematic plan, Mr. Brown, that also comes to mind. And I don't know if you can hear it, but Hobbs woke up and he's meowing excitedly. He is in the I have woken up from my nap and I have been abandoned and left alone and how dare you, I am a poor helpless kitten mood. So first, on October 16th, 1859, John Brown and 18 of his men raided the nearby home of George Washington's great-grandnephew, whose name was Colonel Lewis Washington, but the phrase great-grandnephew is pretty awesome, so I'm just going to keep using that. And the goal of going to that house and raiding it was to free the slaves that were there, and also to take a few historical items that Brown thought would add power to his cause. They also totally kidnapped Colonel Lewis Washington. And so they succeeded in taking the arsenal basically in the middle of the night, and they cut the telegraph lines successfully in both north and south directions to prevent the news of the raid from spreading. However, the real problem was that in the middle of the night, the raiders allowed a train to pass through the ferry and the arsenal and the arsenal's engine room. Like, all of this is right around where a train goes through, because this whole area is about transportation. And so they allowed this train to pass through despite the fact that they had already taken the place, which allowed the news to spread anyway. Afterward, Brown called that one choice his one mistake. Also, it was apparently really unusually cold that night, about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and so that might have been impacting everyone's thought processes.
Yeah.
And so as Arsenal employees arrived for work later that morning, they were taken hostage. There were several dozen of them at least. John Brown and his compatriots made sure that they were safe and protected, but they were kept hostage. And so then the state militia, which was warned by those on that late-night train, arrived that morning, and the shooting began. Brown had been expecting hundreds of slaves seeking freedom to join him at the ferry, but unfortunately the news had not really spread correctly. People knew that he was going to do a thing, but they didn't know where to go, they didn't know how to contact him, that sort of thing. And so eventually no one came, and what essentially happened was that Brown just stayed in one place too long. At one point, during the fighting, he attempted to surrender along with his forces, but he had sent out 2 men with a white flag of truce, and his son was one of them, and then there was another man, and both of them were killed, and also, unfortunately, both of them died by gunshot wounds after several agonizing hours. It was not good. Another one of his sons was shot and killed and died, I think, much quicker, while he was standing right next to John Brown in the Arsenal engine room. And his third participating son was back at their original base at the farmhouse, guarding their cache of supplies, and he and the other 2 men who were with him would manage to escape, along with a couple others. And so then, later that night, the Marines, led by Robert E. Lee, yes, that Robert E. Lee, arrived later on, and they had several howitzers with them, and they broke down the Arsenal's engine house door. 10 raiders would be killed during the raid, 5 of them escaped, and the rest captured and tried. Yeah.
That is a lot.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating. He clearly made more than one mistake. Yes, the train getting through, a mistake. But not properly communicating, then not getting the word out to those who he was hoping would support the raid, also a mistake. because then it's just a handful of guys. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so picking up from there, after the raid ended on October 18th, John Brown and those captured with him were quickly sent to trial. The first question was, would it be federal or state jurisdiction? But since there were no federal facilities nearby and President Buchanan, actively did not care where the trial took place, it became a state trial, which also conveniently was much cheaper, and it was held in the Jefferson County Courthouse in Charlestown, not Charleston. And there was a great deal of military presence for security purposes from the moment of Brown's capture all the way through the trial. 1 week later, the grand jury was held on October 25th, and because of Brown's injuries, was it from the raid or from the arrest or from both?
I mean, yeah, he was severely injured during the military's process of entering the arsenal. So, the actual arrest itself, by that point, he was already pretty much on the ground and not moving.
Okay.
Is my understanding.
Okay. So, because of his injuries from the military response to the raid, John Brown was unable to stand for the whole of the trial, and so lay on a pallet instead. And he asked for a brief delay of the trial for 1 to 3 days to allow him to recover his hearing, because I don't know if you know, but guns are loud, and back in the day, probably even louder. And for his legal counsel to arrive, because Judge Richard Parker had given him legal representation, which he is, obligated to receive, that was pro-slavery. And so they're not going to do a great job at defending someone who is doing a thing specifically because of being an abolitionist. Yeah. And Richard Parker denied the delays, claiming to fear violence from the level of public interest in the events and the trial. And the charges that were brought against John Brown were conspiring to create a slave rebellion, treason against the state of Virginia, and murder of a handful of civilians and military personnel killed during the raid, as well as their compatriots. John Brown actually didn't seem to care if he received a trial. He was ready to be executed immediately, but was apparently upset at having been promised a fair trial and then being granted an unfair trial, a trial where he couldn't stand up, he couldn't follow what was being said, and he didn't even have his own legal counsel or any legal counsel that was not pro-slavery. And his legal counsel arrived a day into the trial on the 29th and was not allowed time to read the indictment, read the testimony already given. It was jump in feet first and go.
Yeah.
And John Brown refused to use an insanity defense, which is a bold thing because, that was probably, his one shot at getting off on it or not getting killed. And he didn't do it for reasons of insanity. He did it for sane reasons. So the prosecution's main witness was George Washington's great-grandnephew Lewis, and Robert E. Lee filed an affidavit on what happened when the Marines stormed the Arsenal engine room and ended the raid. And in all of this, the defense pointed out that the arsenal in question was a federal army, and so the state of Virginia didn't have jurisdiction to prosecute that. To which the prosecution pointed out that those killed outside the armory, whose deaths were being counted as murder, were killed on Virginia soil and were Virginia citizens. It was also then pointed out that John Brown was not a citizen of Virginia, so could not commit treason against a state he wasn't a citizen of, which then the court pointed out the Bill of Rights and the overlapping citizen rights and responsibilities of the state. And then the defense pointed out it could hardly be called a slave rebellion when no slaves actually participated. And the court once again, didn't seem to care about that. And the defense also pointed out that John Brown actually protected the prisoners taken, including George Washington's great-grandnephew, and none of them were harmed. The great-grandnephew replied he'd been forced to watch men die after hours of agony from gunshot wounds, which makes you wonder if it wasn't one of John Brown's kids that he had to watch die after hours of agony from gunshot wounds. So Lewis Washington said that he had to watch people die after hours of agony from gunshot wounds while imprisoned and considered that harm.
That part I actually have trouble arguing with. The rest of these arguments sound kind of ridiculous, but that one, okay.
It is harm and also.
And also, yes.
right? Depending on who he's watching die slowly, like...
Yeah. Most of this trial sounds completely ridiculous. This is perhaps the one most serious part of it.
Yeah. And ultimately, like, the last final thing was that the defense pointed out that 2 men, one of John Brown's sons and the other guy, had been killed under a flag of truce when they had been trying to surrender, but the court didn't care about that either. So, again, proper rules of war not being followed by the military.
Yeah. There were also a couple of smaller points the defense tried to make that the court just didn't care about, but at some point I had to, suppress. Yeah. So
it took the jury all of 45 minutes to deliberate on October 31st, which is Halloween and Reformation Day. And while a reporter who was present said that the only person in the courtroom with a calm and untroubled face was John Brown, the jury delivered a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts, and Brown was hanged just over a month later on December 2nd, 1859, and the trial of his 4 captured co-conspirators, who were 2 white men and 2 black men, followed Brown's trial immediately, and all of them were found guilty, and they were executed by hanging on December 10th.
Yes.
So
apparently Virginia had a law at the time that the minimum amount of time between the sentencing and the execution had to be at least 1 month for whatever reason. And so both of those sets of executions were precisely 1 month after the date of sentencing, which happened in November. So
that tracks. That makes sense, though, like, for any extra evidence that might come up or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that part I also wasn't arguing with, but still. And then, of course, there is the song. I love the song. The song actually might be a large part of why I found out about John Brown's story as well, because when I heard the story of the song, I had to learn the story of the guy. So apparently, during the Civil War, which, by the way, of course, is after John Brown's death, there was this unit in the Union Army. I'm unclear on which one, but this unit had a soldier in it named John Brown. And his fellow soldiers thought that was hilarious. And so they were joking among themselves about their fellow soldier John Brown, and of course that led them to comparing him with this, historical Harper's Ferry John Brown. And so in the end, what happened was somewhere along the line, a song got written called the John Brown Song or John Brown's Body, which was sung to the tune that is now known as the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The tune itself, I think, was kind of known, but didn't really have any set lyrics to it. It was a tune that had been played for a while, but there was no particular song that was known to go with it at this point. And so the first verse of the song is the line, "John Brown's body lies mouldering in the grave." You repeat that 3 times, and then you finish with the line, "His soul is marching on." So if you've heard the Battle Hymn of the Republic, that's the song you sing that to. And so after the song became well known, so that one verse became like classic.
Gotcha.
And well known, and became sort of like a tune of the Union Army. Because what they're basically saying is, John Brown might be dead, but we are marching on. We are the Union Army. We are doing his work, right?
Yeah.
And so after the tune and the song became well-known and, kind of an instant cult classic, it was not being made into, popular sheet music, but every soldier knew it, basically, and then their families knew it. And so after a little while, some people started adding other verses to the song, most of which were considerably less morbid, you might say. And finally, after a while, a woman named Julia Ward Howe was suggested by someone, we actually don't know who made the suggestion to her, this is an awfully good tune, but it needs more respectable lyrics, so could you maybe write something? And so then Julia Ward Howe wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which since then has become the song that this tune is known for. But originally, this tune was all about John Brown's body.
Interesting. I did not realize that.
Yeah, so like I said, when I heard this story, I had to find out the full story of the guy.
Yeah.
And so, what do you love about them? Well, John Brown was a rare, free person who was willing to both risk his own death to free enslaved people, and also, frankly, willing to kill people to free enslaved people. And as I have talked to people who are not white, unlike myself, both of those aspects have been considered important by folks who are descended from slaves, both willing to die and also to kill others on the behalf of people who are powerless. Both of those are important distinctions.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the clarity of call in it, right? He has a clear call to work against slavery, to work for abolition. And then he's superhuman, right? He is a very human human.
Yeah. If you've ever seen a picture of this guy's face, I have to say that in terms of, like, determination in a face, he is right up there with Abraham Lincoln. My goodness.
All right. I did not know that. But I think also, like, yes, human. And, like, Frederick Douglass was right. Frederick Douglass looked at his plans, said, that's a suicide mission. And he made changes, but missed enough things that Frederick Douglass was right. There was no staying alive. And that was not his goal, right? He clearly was at peace with that. He clearly knew it was a good chance. There's a question of how much everybody else knew. Like, everybody else knew there's a chance of being killed, but did everybody know how great the chance was of him being killed?
For example, one of the black men who joined with the 21 guys, I have no idea if he actually wound up at the ferry or not, because I couldn't figure out who was who on that score. But one of the black men who joined him actually was with Frederick Douglass when Frederick Douglass came to talk to John Brown, and the other black guy said, actually, no, I'm going to go with this. I'll stay. And Frederick Douglass left.
Yeah, so I love that we have someone who is literally putting his life on the line, and also someone who's really real.
Yeah. If we wanted to send someone back in time to offer some strategic suggestions and maybe some communication options.
Yeah. Tie-ins to today's theme.
Slavery bad.
Slavery bad. Abolition good. Listen to black people.
Murder also bad, but also, like, under these circumstances...
Murder complicated?
Yeah, I don't,
Also, I think it's interesting that they called it murder. Because from a legal perspective, murder has intent with it.
Yeah, there's a few different situations of what happened. On the one hand, like in America today, if you are charged with a felony and someone else was killed, even if they were like doing the crime with you in the process of committing that felony, then you are charged with their murder. And so I think some of it was that. There were a few military personnel who were there to fight against John Brown's people that died. I don't know that that really counts as murder, but the court was totally counting it that way. And then the civilians who died are more complicated because, like, one of them, the very first guy who died, actually, this is a tragic story, in the middle of the night when John Brown and his compatriots took over the arsenal. Like I said, there's a train track right there that the train would later go on. There was a baggage handler who was on duty that night who heard the noise and, like, it wasn't clear, I guess, at first, mostly because the arsenal, there weren't people there at night. It was just locked up. And so it wasn't clear at first what was going on. And so the baggage handler came out to look around and see what was going on and, like, you know, are the raccoons back knocking over trash cans or something like that? And John Brown's people saw him, told him to stop. He did not. He kept walking away. They shot him in the back and he died. And he was also a freed black man. And he was the first person to die at Harper's Ferry. Yeah. So, like, when they say there was murder going on, that's not a good part of the story, and that was definitely used by people speaking against John Brown to speak against his cause. But also, it's the middle of the night. They don't know who this guy is. He didn't exactly introduce himself. So,
Yeah, that sucks.
And things were much darker back then, quite literally, because they didn't have electric light either.
Yeah. So, murder complicated.
Yeah.
Still generally bad.
Yeah.
Slavery is murder, so...
Right. So, for media tie-ins, obviously, we have the song, John Brown's Body. There is also a poem called John Brown's Body, which was written in 1928, and that tells the story of what happened.
We'll try and find it and link to it if we can.
Also, the progressive rock band Kansas, who you may have heard of, on their debut album, which was hilariously named Kansas, has part of a mural featuring John Brown from the Topeka State House as the album's cover art. It is, like, heavily color edited so that it looks sort of monochrome. And the mural itself is called Tragic Prelude. And John Brown looks really impressive in it.
Yeah.
He is a marvelously drawn character for that.
Yeah. Also, interesting that it's Topeka, because Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas.
Yeah.
Different Brown, obviously.
Yeah. Right.
Also, Fire on the Mountain is a 1988 novel by Terry Bison about what would have happened if Harper's Ferry had succeeded in starting a rebellion. Of note, Fire on the Mountain is not the song by Asa, this South African singer.
Right.
Although that's also a good song.
Also, we are not necessarily endorsing these novels because we haven't read them.
Oh, yeah.
I have no idea how good they are.
Yeah. I have no idea how good they are.
But I have no idea about this particular one.
Okay. And then also, Flashman and the Angel of the Lord is a 1994 novel by George MacDonald Fraser about if his fictional character Flashman had been at Harper's Ferry. And The Good Lord Bird is a 2013 novel by James McBride about one of the enslaved people who joined John Brown at Harper's Ferry, and later a miniseries was made of it in 2020 called The Good Lord Bird. And then Emperor is a 2020 movie about one of the black men who joined the raid at Harper's Ferry. So is that connected to the James McBride
I
one?
think that's a different black guy from Harper's
Okay.
Ferry. But no, those two things are not connected.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification.
Right. And then more classically, A Plea for Captain John Brown was an essay written by Henry David Thoreau, which was first read aloud by the author on October 30th, 1859 in Concord, Massachusetts. So he was a fair distance away from the trial, but he knew that the trial was going on, and he made a plea for John Brown in the form of an essay. And then finally, The Puritan is a statue of John Brown, which is still in Springfield, Massachusetts, and it has been copied and erected in many other cities ever since at various sizes. But it is apparently a very impressive statue to see in person and really gives you an idea of how forceful John Brown's personality was.
Nice.
Yeah. So other themes that tie in with our theme for today of free people trying to aid and free enslaved people. I think we had a fairly constant theme of like war crimes and related stuff to that.
War crimes and guerrilla warfare, but also like when I think about Paul's letter to Philemon, the like unconventional tactics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, unconventional tactics that, like...
There's all kinds of different ways you can go about this, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that is really helpful, particularly in a superhero spectacular season, right? That there is not just one way. Paul writes a letter. Kira fights with her people in guerrilla warfare resistance tactics. Mm-hmm. John Brown tries to start his own doesn't try and start his own rebellion, but tries to arm a rebellion.
Yeah.
And none of those are the Civil War, right? None of those are, like, equal footing fighting diplomacy. They all have, like, some amount of unconventionality to it, which I think is a helpful reminder to us when we think about what does it look like for us to be heroes? What does it look like for us to resist things like incarceration, slavery, genocide, all of that stuff? Do we actually need to do it the conventional route? And it raises the question, does it actually work to write letters, call senators, and vote, right? Is that actually working for the purpose of protecting those who are most vulnerable, oppressed, and being killed? Or do we need to do something else? What is the role of nonviolent resistance, and what is the role of violent resistance?
Right. I would also point out that, like, while we're at it, this podcast would never say that you shouldn't vote. Like, by all means vote. You may also just have to do other things as well. I
consider voting to be harm reduction.
Yes. And also something that people have literally died for me to have the right to do, so...
Mm-hmm. Same.
Yeah.
Yep. Any other themes or tie-ins that you thought of?
Really memorable fashion sense seems to be... Kira Nerys has some great outfits, too, although she's usually in a uniform. And John Brown is just, again, a very memorable figure, partly because he continued to wear Puritan outfits, I believe. Mm-hmm. And, yeah.
And you know that Paul would have sent somebody fabulous to deliver this message.
I would certainly hope. Goodness knows Philemon would have been fabulous.
Yeah.
If Paul is being this flowery in his language to Philemon, I get the feeling Philemon had some taste, I'm just saying.
True.
Yeah. And now for our Muppets Moment. Which Muppet would you cast for which hero? I do have an idea, but I think it's Emily's turn to go first.
I mean, you can go first if you want. There's something rolling around, but it's not fully formed. So you go first and then I'll...
So I will admit that this is something that might make a bit more sense if you have actually seen a photograph of John Brown, but I think we have finally found our hero who needs to be played by Sam Eagle. The cheekbones are absolutely on par. Like, that is exactly who that needs to be. There is definitely the force of personality and the patriotism and the importance of Americanism and everyone being equal.
And the beak!
Yes. Yeah, John Brown has one heck of a nose. And so, yeah, I think we have finally found the ideal hero for Sam the Eagle to play, and I am delighted with that.
I love that. I think it is so good. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm totally here for that.
Because Sam the Eagle can totally play heroes occasionally, they just have to be very carefully chosen. He is not always a villain.
It's true. But he's a particular... Yeah.
He has a flair.
Yes. He definitely has a flair. I was trying to think of... It's hard because now that you've said Sam Eagle, I'm like, yes, Sam Eagle. I was thinking more of... I guess I wouldn't necessarily cast Animal as Kira Nerys, but I think Animal...
Definitely a different hairstyle.
Yeah. I think Animal would be really great at guerrilla warfare.
I think Kira Nerys and Animal would be having a fabulous time together. Yeah. Animal could totally be one of Kira's seconds during the war.
Yeah.
And during the occupation. I think she'd love that. Also, I don't know that her character plays a musical instrument. I don't think she does. I also could totally see her in a rock band. Like, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, she's queer-coded, so of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gonzo could totally be the one delivering Paul's letter.
Yeah.
He's got the storytelling and the personality to do it.
Sure.
Okay. That's good. Thank you for joining us, dear nerdlings. Our theme music was by Rachel Meyer-Laughlin, our Muppets music was by Brenda Boss, and our seasonal artwork was by Pace Warfield. Catch us next time when we'll dive into making space and amplifying others' voices with our special guests, Reverend Angela Kabeb and Reverend Jenny Sung, who are editor and contributor, respectively, to The Call to Allyship, which is an awesome newish book out, and we're really excited about it.
Yeah.
And our conversation with them was already recorded and was fabulous. So we already know it's going to be a great episode for you all next time. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and Blue Sky at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsattchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut episodes, merch discounts, movie commentaries, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. Starting at just $5 per month, it's cheaper than fomenting and trying to create a rebellion and/or end a military occupation, either way.
Truth.
Please don't attack any federal arsenals while saying that we told you to. We did not. We have not told you to attack any federal arsenals.
Yeah.
So.
We're not asking you to incite violence. But nonviolent resistance, go for it.
Sure.
Also, let us know on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Twitter which Muppets you would cast for our heroes this week.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax Vobiscum.